Thoughts turning about thee with annual and diurnal motion, thoughts of light, thoughts of light, let thy perpetual radiance partner to continual labor and enjoyment, so that as we are constant partakers of thy bounty, we may in our particular orbit give out light and light, sustenance and joy to them that revolve about us, without diminution of substance or effulgence forever. Lord, secret and most holy, source of light, source of light, source of love, source of liberty, be thou ever constant and mighty within us. Source of energy.
I first became interested in Aleister Crowley back in the mid-70s in high school. Yes, I'm that old. Right after I broke away from the Abrahamic yoke and discovered the occult. And I still have a fascination with him to this day. Yes, I know he was a right-hand path narcissist who, in the beginning, probably got into the occult just to piss off his strict Christian mother, and that eventually became a fat, bloated, hedonistic junkie with a messianic complex, and that the poet W.B. Yeats called indescribably mad. But hey, who isn't? Yeah, there's some truth to all that. But what can't be denied is his impact, which is still being felt to this day. Now, if Edward Alexander Crowley had been born in 1975 America instead of 1875 England, right now he'd either be a rock star or a member of Congress. Or, as a kid, he would have been given Ritalin and would now be a well-known TV evangelist. Who knows? What I do know is, no matter what you think of him, you can't argue his importance to the occultic world of the 20th and 21st centuries, and to the Western culture in general. A whole lot of that hedonistic mysticism of the 1960s stems directly from Crowley. His call for a reworking of society couldn't have been more suitable for the 60s libertarian culture of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. He influenced such people as Timothy Leary, the Beatles, the Doors, David Bowie, and, of course, Jimmy Page, who was not only a practitioner of the dark arts in his own right, but also purchased Crowley's one-time home, Boleskine House, where Crowley, way back when, attempted the Abramelin ritual. You could say Black Sabbath, Marilyn Manson, and Nine Inch Nails were all disciples of the great B666. He even influenced punk rock, which was the manifestation of Do It Thou Wilt. Hell, he was voted the 73rd most influential Briton of all time, right between Henry V and Robert the Bruce. But then again, it was a TV poll, and that vapid blonde Lady Di was voted the 3rd most influential. But I digress. Because of Crowley's belief that through a life of excess you could break beyond societal restraints, thus achieving some form of self-overcoming, you could say he was a Nietzschean apostle, though Nietzsche would have had little use for him. Also, because he wanted to bring about the end of Christianity and the dawn of a new age, he has had a wide influence on the modern New Age movement. He played a pioneering role in the Western study of Eastern religions. His writings on yoga are still regarded as some of the most lucid ever written. and Gerald Gardner borrowed much from Crowley to create something called Wicca. In the end, it doesn't matter whether you believe in Crowley's magic or not, or whether you think he was an asshole or not. He kicked a door open that is still off its hinges to this day. A door I don't believe could ever be repaired. The point I'm trying to make is you can't deny his impact, directly or indirectly, because even though he was right-hand path, I don't think half of you right now would be on the left-hand path if it weren't for him. I know I wouldn't. Recently, I was on a podcast, and I was asked the question, which figure out of the, let's say, occultic past would you have liked to have met? And my response was Aleister Crowley. Now, I know some of you basically like to dismiss him, not understanding his significance. You look back at him now and you think, well, what did he do that was so outrageous? What made him so relevant? Well, what you're failing to do is put him in the context of his time period. You are guilty of what's called presentism. You are looking at him through the eyes of somebody who lives in the 21st century. Crowley was born in the Victorian age, and most of what he did was, well, in the Edwardian, let's say. And in those very, restrictive time periods, how he acted, what he espoused, just the fact he was open about his bisexuality was outrageous. Now, the importance of Crowley is, besides his books and his magical teachings, was his basic outlook toward the world, toward life, the do it thou wilt philosophy. Because of this, you had the free love, the outrageousness of the 60s. Certain artists, musical artists that you're all familiar with, I've gone through this list before, like David Bowie, Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Tool, Black Sabbath, so on and so forth, were all directly influenced by this man. If you know anything about Crowley, you already know this. Now, recently, somebody posted that Crowley was of the left-hand path. What he did, of course, was outrageous. 100 years ago, at this time period, right now, 100 years ago, he was in Sicily, in Cefalù, at the Abbey of Thelema, doing some very hedonistic, over-the-top rituals with his followers, his little cult, if you will. And this was a precursor of what was to come in the 1960s with communes and free love and drugs. There was a lot of drugs at the Abbey of Thelema. Now, just because he did this stuff does not necessarily mean he was on the left-hand path. Now, one way of knowing that he was not on the left-hand path is the basic fact that he had his followers cut themselves anytime they said the word I. He was trying to squash their egos, Where on the left-hand path, you emphasize the ego, the self, the individual. He didn't want any individuals. But at the same time, he was an innovator. He did things his own way. And that right there is an attribute of the path. Carving out your own path, doing things your own way. So there's the basic paradox of Crowley. But at the same time, Crowley himself, he always denied he was of the left-hand path. He one time, attempted to sue someone who called him a black magician, where we on the path proudly take that title or accept that title. So I guess in some ways, whether you are on the path or not determines where your heart is and what your final destination is. The sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage is a ritual to attain knowledge from one's holy guardian angel. It is perhaps the most popular hermetic magical operation, having deeply shaped modern occultism. With the earliest known manuscript written in German and dated to 1608, it is considered the one supremely important magical ritual by Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn. The book, The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, details the story of Abraham the Jew, 1360 to 1460, in his explorations seeking out a true system of magic, eventually finding himself in Egypt. There it is said he met the man, Abramelin, who taught him the sacred magic. The text is commonly separated into 3 books. The first describes Abraham meeting with Abramelin. The second book outlines the Abramelin operation, a ritual process that can last from 6 to 18 months. The third book contains individual spells with sigils in the form of word squares. These spells are similar to those found in Goetic magic, and they cover a diverse range of hidden knowledge from flight to resurrection to shape-shifting to divination and so on. When performed correctly, the Abramelin operation involves a period of withdrawal from society, focused daily prayer and meditation, and a number of other moral guidelines similar to those found in monastic traditions around the world. It's broken down into progressive phases of increasingly diligent practices. The Abramelin ritual dispenses with the use of circles and seals and ornate conjurations popular at the time. Abraham condemned these other practices as false and as traps to ensnare the magician. He warns that one should not practice any form of magic that does not fall within the realm of sacred magic. Now, even though the objective is to commune with one's holy guardian angel, elements of this system concern the use of demons. The demons are conjured and sworn to obedience, beginning with the 4 kings and moving down through the hierarchy. The text sometimes contains several magical squares composed of groups of letters. These squares each serve a different purpose, and there are certain demons who may be called for those purposes. Within differing hours of the day, different familiar spirits serve the magician. The magician simply holds up the square appropriate to his desire, thus served by the demon appropriate to the square. Overall, the work is consistent with Kabbalistic and Goetic ritual practices at the time. And starting in the 19th century, there was a reemergence of this system of Kabbalistic magic. Its popularity is evident in such occult organizations as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley's mystical system of Thelema. So, why did I have a warning at the beginning of this video? And from a psychological perspective, what's really going on when one partakes in the Abramelin operation? Many modern Kabbalah practitioners believe that the initiates of the Abramelin use the ritual as a tool to transform the mind into something more closely resembling the mind of God. Now, this might sound silly, but from a Jungian perspective, it makes sense. That is, if God is one's own highest ideal. In truth, this practice, which calls for right conduct, action, study, rigorous periods of meditation, and social withdrawal, have some very real similarities to esoteric Buddhist and Hindu tantric rituals. But the act of closing oneself off from the outside world and the day-to-day routines for months on end can be damaging to one's psyche. Just ask anyone who spent time in solitary confinement. In conclusion, if you're strong enough to withstand the cloistered lifestyle, the Abramelin operation can be taken as a deeply meditative, transformative thought exercise rather than a literal summoning of angels and demons. In Cairo, Egypt, over the span of 3 days in April 1904, Aleister Crowley sat down for 1 hour each of those days and wrote what was to become the central sacred text of Thelema, and one of the most well-known and important books of magic. Dictated to Crowley by the entity Aiwaz, it is said that the text would usher in a new stage in the spiritual evolution of humankind, which was to be known as the Aeon of Horus. Crowley's path leading to the writing of the Book of the Law began on March 16, 1904. While Crowley was performing a ritual in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza, his wife, Rose Kelly, began, out of the blue, muttering the words, "They're waiting for you." Crowley had no idea what she meant by this until a couple of days later, during an invocation, Rose mentioned that it was Horus who was waiting for him. Now, it was said that Rose didn't have much interest in magic, so these seeming to be mystical revelations made Crowley go, Still a bit skeptical, though, he decided he would test his lovely bride. So he took Rose to the museum in Cairo, where he asked her to locate an image of Horus. Passing a number of other representations of Horus, she eventually stopped before an image of him on a stele numbered 666, that which would be known to the Thelemites as the Stele of Revealing. But Rose would claim that the message didn't actually come from Horus himself, but instead from his courier, if you will, an entity called Aiwass. And for 3 days, beginning on April 8th, Crowley was to enter the temple and write down what he heard between noon and 1 p.m. So, in the honeymoon apartment in a fashionable European quarter of Cairo, Crowley sat at his desk. And from the furthest corner of the room came the voice of Aiwass. Crowley insisted that the experience was exactly like someone was speaking to him, and that the voice had a deep timbre, musical and expressive, its tone solemn, voluptuous, tender, fierce, devoid of native or foreign accent. He also stated that Aiwass's general appearance was of a body composed of fine matter, which had a gauze-like transparency. Tall, dark man in his 30s, well-knit, active and strong, with the face of a savage king and eyes veiled, lest the gaze should destroy what they saw. After all was said and done, Crowley made a few copies of the manuscript for evaluation by close friends, eventually getting it published in 1909. Now, what's the Book of the Law all about? To begin with, the well-known verse, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," which forms the core of Crowley's practice, is found in this book. The book is the go-to source material for Crowley's students and occultists in general. It's a rather short book and is often found published in a pamphlet form, where Christians have the Bible and Jews have the Torah. The Thelemites have the Book of the Law. Now, the book has 3 chapters, 1 chapter for each member of a trinity of ruling deities. First is Nuet, whose message is of freedom, love, and mystical bliss. Second is Hadit, the winged solar globe, symbol of divine authority. And third in this trinity is the child produced by the union of Nuet and Hadit, the lords of the new aeon. Throughout the book, 2 other mystic figures stand out, the great beast and the Scarlet Woman, who appears to be representations of Crowley and Rose themselves. The style and phrasing in the book is often ambiguous, with an odd, otherworldly prose poetic style which many find illuminating. And because of its ambiguity, various interpretations of the book's meanings are possible. Crowley himself, depending on his mood, gave different interpretations of verses, often being at odds with what appears to be the surface meaning. Now, the question is often asked, did the book's contents really come from some supernatural entity, or was it from Crowley's subconscious? Crowley did admit to the possibility of Aiwass being identified with his own subconscious, although he thought it was unlikely. But Israel Regardie, Crowley's former secretary, claimed the master Therion never objected to the idea that Aiwass was a part of his unconscious mind, claiming that it can safely be said that current psychological theory would agree that any one person is possessed of all sorts of knowledge and power of which he is totally unconscious. Both Freudian and Jungian theory are on the side of such an assumption. Rigardi also argued that Rose's ability to answer Crowley's questions about Horace, that wasn't as remarkable as Crowley insisted, because he often used her as a sounding board for many of his own ideas. Thus, she may have had a greater knowledge of magic than Crowley claimed. It's also been stated that the style of writing is too similar to Crowley's other poetic works to be the product of something supernatural. Now, besides an otherworldly entity or regurgitated from Crowley's personal unconscious, could there be a third choice for the source of the book? Could Aiwass have been an avatar of an archetype of the collective unconscious? Who knows? I know it's a confusing read, yet intriguing, and it should be read by all occultists. On the Isle of Sicily, in a town called Cefalù, there's an old rundown villa. It's been vacant for over 90 years, except for tourists paying their respects or locals adding to its decrepitude through acts of vandalism. The building's roof is partly caved in, and upon its cracked and gaping floors are heaps of garbage and debris, weeds and shrubbery. Some original furnishings are still there, though marred by rust and decay. The walls, those that are still intact, feature modern graffiti showing little of the original paintings by its most infamous inhabitant. Back between 1920 and 1923, this place was known as the Abbey of Thelema, and it was not only the Thelemic spiritual center, but also home of Aleister Crowley, where, within its walls, took place some of the most extreme occult practices one can imagine. A precursor to the twisted cults and communes that would come decades later. Like most occultists, I've been fascinated by Aleister Crowley since I first read about him. Now, I understand if some of you are frustrated with Crowley, believing he was more hype than substance, that he was an emotionally stunted man-child with a bad case of arrested development due to his Christian fundamentalist upbringing and possibly being on the autism spectrum. But no one can deny his genius and his influence, not only on modern occultism, but also on modern Western culture in general. It's said that in 1919, Crowley received a vision telling him to establish a sanctuary where Thelema, his religion, if you will, can be practiced. I don't claim to be an expert in Thelema, but its basic principle is famously summed up in, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." So, in 1920, for a small amount of money, Crowley, along with his lover and Scarlet Woman, Leah Herzig, rented a one-story villa in Cefalù on Sicily. Crowley considered this temple a school of magic and gave it an appropriate motto, Collegium ad Spiritum Sanctum, a college toward the Holy Spirit. Now, at the front entrance leading into the villa was the main room. This common room was dedicated to ritual practices, including sacrificial offerings, and was adorned with a scarlet magic circle marked with sigils and signs of the major Thelemic deities. Besides the expensive oil paintings Crowley brought from France to adorn the walls of the abbey, in Crowley's bedroom, labeled by himself as the Room of Nightmares, were images hand-painted directly on the walls by the occultist himself. These explicitly erotic frescoes featured hermaphroditic goblins and vividly colored monsters and demons. This private room was used for specific night initiations involving an array of psychoactive drugs. Daily life at the Abbey of Thelema included yoga, sex magic, orgies, and the worship of numerous deities. Despite the esoteric hedonism, there was a domestic side to the commune, with both Leah and another woman, Nanette Shumway, having kids fathered by Crowley. Unfortunately, though, Leah's daughter died not long after they arrived at the Abbey. Now, the children who lived there were free to roam around, go where they want. Thus, they couldn't help but be exposed to the sexually explicit and violent rituals. Rituals supposedly directed by the secret chiefs, Crowley's invisible spirit guides. Well, these secret chiefs must have been some deviant bastards, because for one special ritual, they told Crowley to have a goat fuck Leah, and at the moment the goat orgasmed, Crowley was to slit its throat. This was supposed to unleash some intense magical energy. But the animal didn't exactly cooperate with the demands of the secret chiefs. I guess he didn't find Leah all that sexy, so Crowley killed it anyway, its blood spattering the Scarlet Woman. Leah, confused, asked, "What should I do now?" One of the women in attendance, English writer Mary Butts, replied, "I'd have a bath if I were you." Besides well-known writers, other celebrities such as Hollywood actress Jane Wolfe and British model Betty May visited the Abbey. In Betty May's case, though, this was more her husband Raoul Loveday's idea. Betty not so heavy into the whole Thelemic thing. Now, Betty had some interest, but supposedly she only partook in rituals directed by Crowley out of fear of being booted out of the Abbey. At the beginning of 1923, Crowley warned his followers not to drink from a spring near the commune. Unfortunately, Betty and Raoul did not heed his warning and drank the water. Being somewhat sickly by nature, Loveday's immune system was not strong enough to fight off the bacteria from the natural spring water, and he died from a bacterial infection on February 16, 1923. Betty was both shattered and furious over her husband's death, ultimately blaming Crowley. She was convinced Loveday died, not from the water, but from an infection caused by consuming the blood of a cat which Crowley had directed him to sacrifice during a ritual. In revenge, Betty moved back to London and exposed the great beast and his bizarre ritualistic practices to the press. The Sunday Express interviewed her, and her stories were picked up by newspapers in the United States and throughout Europe. When the fascist government of Benito Mussolini got wind of this, Crowley was forced to leave the country in April 1923. The Great Beast and a Scarlet Woman left the Abbey of Thelema and relocated to North Africa. Without them, the abbey was soon abandoned and remains so to this day. The locals of Cefalù whitewashed the demonically painted walls of the abbey not long after Crowley and his disciples departed. Therefore, it was no big surprise that the villa was considered haunted and remained abandoned until 1955, when Kenneth Anger, an experimental filmmaker and Crowley devotee, located the ruins of the villa and attempted unsuccessfully to restore the Chamber of Nightmares. Although the documentary he made about the abbey was never released, Kenneth Anger was able to uncover the majority of Crowley's murals and symbols that the locals had covered 30 years earlier. Even as the once Abbey of Thelema crumbles after decades of abandonment, you can still make a pilgrimage to this location where the great beast and his followers chose to do what thou wilt to its Dionysian extremes. Now, would I have liked to have been there, at least to witness a few of those deviant rituals? Get swept up by the madness? Sure. But strangely, I still kind of feel sorry for that goat.